Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Death of Durbag. In the summer sunshine of the 126th year of the Common Reckoning, bands of orcs happily wandered through the northern hills of the Goblin Downs, looting and burning goblin settlements and killing any goblin that they encountered. Many orcs gained glory and gold. One such orc was Durbag. Durbag had become a slave master at the age of 12 when he challenged his father to ritual combat and struck off his head. At the age of 14 he killed a great she-wolf and domesticated one of her cubs. As the wolf cub grew, Durbag accustomed it to wearing armour and trained it so that Durbag could ride on and fight from its back. Mounted on this ferocious creature, Durbag won several more ritual combats, and so increased the number of his slaves. By the time he was 17 years old, Durbag was renowned and feared among the orcs. And then the orcs encountered the goblins, opening up a new frontier of spoliation and slaughter. Durbag revelled in this opportunity, armouring and arming 5 of his strongest slaves and leading them deep into goblin territory in an orgy of brigandage and bloodshed. In a hollow in the heart of the Goblin Downs stood a farm, surrounded by grassy slopes, cropped close by many sheep and topped by stands of trees. Here dwelt a goblin named Radko, along with his family and the other members of his household. One fine morning Radko's breakfast was interrupted when his shepherd burst into the kitchen in a state of incoherent excitement. On being asked why he had abandoned his woolly charges, the shepherd stammered that a party of armed orcs, one of whom was mounted on a giant wolf, was approaching the farm. Now, faced with this situation, many goblins would simply have fled. But Radko was made of sterner stuff. He ordered the women and children of his house to make immediate haste to put as much distance between them and the approaching orcs as possible. He told his son Mislan to take his shield and axe and run to the next farm to seek assistance. He himself donned his coat of mail, took his shield and a large spiked mace, and ordered the remaining 3 males of the household to arm themselves with whatever weapons they had, and to follow him outside. Radko's younger son had a bow, and his shepherd had a sling. Radko positioned them at the farmyard wall, from where they could shoot at the approaching orcs. He and his farmhand Bosmir, who was armed with a 2-handed spear, stood behind the farmhouse and awaited developments. They did not have to wait for long. Durbag observed the goblins preparing to defend the farm, and was glad at the opportunity for a fight. He ordered his slaves to charge the farm directly, while he circled round in order to attack the goblins from their left. The goblins pelted the advancing orcs with slingstones and arrows, but these projectiles proved unable to penetrate orcan armour and shields. This rather dismayed the defenders. However, their spirits were raised when a shout of encouragement sounded behind them. Mislan was returning and bringing 3 further goblins with him to lend assistance. Durbag responded to the cry of the approaching goblin reinforcements by unsheathing his scimitar, tipping back his head, and letting forth a great shout of his own, a savage war cry, half howl and half scream. And then he urged his wolf forward, and it responded with alacrity, rushing up to the farmyard, leaping over the wall, and charging at Radko's shepherd. Durbag swung his scimitar, and the shepherd's head was cleanly severed from his shoulders. It seems that Bosmir was somewhat fond of the shepherd. In any case, he was extremely upset by this turn of events. In a blind fury, he ran directly toward Durbag, screaming curses at him. Durbag laughed with the joy of battle, and moved to deal with this new foe, encouraging his mount to leap forward and tear out Bosmir's throat. But Bosmir held his ground and his nerve, jamming the butt of his spear into the earth and swinging its point toward the chest of the onrushing wolf. Already committed to the attack, the wolf impaled itself deeply upon the spear. Thrashing in its death throes, it threw Durbag from the saddle and knocked Bosmir off his feet. Durbag put up his arms to break his fall, and his scimitar was dislodged from his grasp. But Bosmir had retained a two-handed grip on his spear. Rising to his feet, he wrenched this weapon from the corpse of the wolf, and, even as Durbag scrabbled in the dust for his blade, Bosmir stabbed him to death. Thus did Durbag perish. His short life had exemplified Orcan virtues, and he met a noble end in battle. While alive, he had only known victory and power, and he was spared having to live with the ignominy of defeat. The goblins might have thought that Bosmir's triumph would win them the battle, but they were wrong. Durbag's slaves were inspired rather than dismayed by the death of their master. After all, they were now all free orcs, at least until one of them proved his worth over the others and stepped into Durbag's shoes. And, in the meantime, there was blood to be spilt and goods to be looted. They continued to advance toward the farm. It is not clear what Radko was thinking at this point. Maybe he felt that now was the moment for a decisive intervention, to tip the balance of the fight completely in the goblin's favour. Maybe he had a rush of blood to the head. In any case, he ran up to the wall that enclosed the farmyard and, vaulting over it, launched himself at the oncoming orcs, and Bosmir followed him into the fray. Bosmir did not last long. He thrust his spear at the orc looming in front of him, but the orc casually turned the spear aside with his shield, stepped forward, and cut Bosmir down. Radko, with his shield and armour, fared somewhat better. Although he did not put even a scratch on the orc he attacked, he did at least manage not to die within the first few seconds of the combat. And now Mislan and his companions arrived. 2 orcs headed in their direction. Although Mislan had a shield, he did not know how to use it, and he did not live long enough to learn. Radko's younger son was cowering behind the farmyard wall. An orc ran toward him, screaming and brandishing a sword. The goblin youth turned and fled. Mislan's party had included a goblin with a bow and another with a fistful of javelins. They launched their respective missiles at the foe, but once more Orcan shields and Orcan armour proved more than adequate for Orcan defence. The 2 orcs who had felled Mislan turned on the third of the goblins he had brought to the fight and made short work of him. Now Radko found himself in difficulties. The orc he had attacked was joined by the orc who had slain Bosmir, and then by the orc who had so frightened Radko's son. Outnumbered 3-1, Radko was hacked down. The other 2 orcs, having already killed Mislan and one of his companions, now turned their attention toward the remaining 2 members of Mislan's group. First, the javelineer was dispatched with brutal efficiency, followed by the archer. And now Radko's younger son was the only goblin that still lived. 2 orcs advanced across the farmyard toward him, with murder in their eyes. With trembling hands he loosed his last remaining arrows at them, but he shot wide. Even as he turned to flee, the leading orc was upon him, and it was all over. None of the goblins survived to bring word of the fight to their fellows, and so no goblin ever learned of Bosmir's bravery. But the orcs long remembered Durbag as a glorious exemplar of all that they considered to be noble and worthy.